Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's online seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute here at the LSE. My name is Francisco Ferreira, and I'll be the chair today. Today's seminar, as you can see on the screen, is entitled New Findings on Global Wealth, Gender, and Carbon Inequalities. And it is basically findings from the World Inequality Report 2022. And to present that, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Chancel back to our Inequality Seminar series. We've been fortunate to have Lucas with us before. He is the co-director of the World Inequality Lab and an affiliate professor at Sciences Po, and he is the lead author of the World Inequality Report 2022. This event is a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar. So ideally, for us, for the speaker in particular, ideally, you'd keep yourself muted, but your camera on. If you can keep your camera on, that's just wonderful for us. So we'd appreciate that. There'll be time for questions at the end, which you can do by using the raise hand function in your reactions button at the bottom of your screen. Just before I hand over to Lucas, a quick mention of the next event at the III. Next week at the same time, we'll have Mountain Tales, Love and Loss in the Municipality of Castaway Belongings. So certainly a more poetic title than today's. Sorry about that, Lucas. And with that, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Chico, for the introduction, and very happy to be back on this seminar. Right, so this is the second edition of the World Inequality Report. The previous one was 4 years back. And I'd like to start with a few general points about this work. It's a report that's based on the work of a large community of scholars all over the world who contribute or who have contributed over the past years to the World Inequality database, which is available on wid.world. We see this report as our first systematic assessment of both global income, but also wealth, gender, and carbon inequalities, at least over 30 years, and we'll try to go even further back in times on certain dimensions which allow it. What we observe, in a nutshell, well, it's a large diversity in inequality trends, in trajectories across countries, which reveal the importance of social policies and tax policies in the determination of inequality, rather than deterministic forces which would impact, which would determine countries' level of inequalities. This is not, this general finding is an extension or confirmation of what we were observing in the past report, but we're now able to go further than in the previous report, in particular thanks to novel findings on pre-tax versus post-tax inequality, novel findings on wealth distributions, and we are now able to cover almost the entire world with wealth distributions, and also new dimensions, which I will refer to in a few slides in a few moments, including gender and carbon. All of this is available online, so the report is going to be published in a paper in print in a few months at Harvard University Press in English, but you can access the report on the website, which is presented here on this slide, along with all the codes and the underlying data that we've been using. Indeed, a part of the project is to try to, increase the size of the committee of researchers affiliated to the World Inequality database, so that we can update the series, improve the scope of analysis in as many countries as we can. So let me start with a few important reminders here about why we're doing this, why we think this effort of collecting, harmonizing, updating, publishing this data is not fully done so far by statistical institutions and by governments, and that's why groups of researchers should do it. Well, the starting point is that, you know, inequality is everywhere, but it's still missing from most public statistics. And we have insights into high levels of inequality through rich lists, you know, Pandora Papers, HSBC leaks, etc. Also social movements across the world. But in most countries, we still do not have annual or quarterly publication on the distribution of economic growth. And this really is something that is lacking in democracy, because it makes it impossible to properly evaluate government actions when you don't have information about who benefits from economic policies, and when you don't have timely information and systematic or internationally comparable information on the matter. The work of the World Inequality Lab and underlying this report is continuing a longer tradition of work in inequality studies. And I'm sure, you know, most of you here are familiar with this work, which starts with the pioneering publication of Kuznets and subsequently Tony Atkinson in the 50s and in the late 70s, mobilizing tax data to track inequality in the long run and in a comparative way across countries. This work was extended in the 2000 and 2010s by Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, Facundo Alvarado, Gabriel Zuckman, and then the project expanded. This led to the creation of the World Top Incomes Database. And this database was itself augmented and led to the creation of the project as we know it, as we're running it today. The World Inequality Database, the change in name reflected the change in focus. So not only on the top of the distribution, but also on the bottom 99%, what is happening within the bottom 99%, within the bottom 50% of the distribution. And we're not only looking at incomes, but also wealth and more and more, as much as we can, other dimensions of well-being, other dimensions of inequality. The methodological contribution of this report and of the past 4 years really is this new version of the distributional national accounts guidelines, which, according to us, provide a flexible approach to the distribution of the totality of national income and of national wealth and its subcomponents within countries. What the distributional national accounts seeks to do is really use the strength of all data sources. That's standard sources like household surveys, tax data, which the foundational bricks of this project have been using, but not only tax data, also national accounts, rich lists. And what we try to do is really combine them in a systematic and transparent manner. This is a cumulative process. So as I was saying a few seconds back, series are constantly improved thanks to better data access and to methodological improvements. And we welcome everybody to contribute to this endeavor. This is a collaborative enterprise. So, well, here is you know, just snapshot into, you know, the team of researchers who have contributed to the project over the years. And basically this slide just to say that this is a very rich ecosystem in which we're part of. So the lab is doing some work, and we're trying to develop partnerships with other institutions. Over the past few years, we've developed partnerships with the United Nations, UNDP, UN Stats, with also national statistical offices in France, for instance, with France Statistics, with came to a common agreement, you know, of common methods and concepts to distribute the totality of national accounts. We're trying to replicate this work, this collaborative work with national accountants, national statisticians in other countries. And indeed, we are mobilizing the concepts and the data of many other groups of inequality researchers, Luxembourg Income Study Indeed, Commitment for Equity Institute, Southern Center for Inequality Studies. It is a vast ecosystem. And I think in this ecosystem, we don't always share exactly the same methods, but we are faced with the same challenges. And these are the heterogeneity of data and the lack of common standards across the globe. So I think we all share common goals when I'm thinking about also partner research centers across over countries. What we try to do is really develop public data systems that are fit for 21st century challenges. And indeed, inequality is one of the most important challenges of our time. So how does the World Inequality Database look today? Well, we have income and wealth series for more than 140 countries. We have distributional income and wealth series for over 140 countries as well. We now have Longrun Inequality series for world regions and a couple of key countries across the world. And there are also new developments to the project, so political cleavages and social inequalities, which is a spin-off of the World Inequality Database, which you can see on wpid.world. Now, so this report is an attempt to, late 2021, summarize, synthesize, and editorialize the content of this vast database. And so this is what I'll try to present in the coming minutes, in the coming slides. And I'd like to start with this key result, which is the level of global income and wealth inequality today. So we here have three indicators of inequality: the share of income accruing to the bottom 50%, to the middle 40% in green, and to the top 10% in red. So in a perfectly unequal society, the top 10% would capture 100% of total income or total wealth. And in a perfectly equal society, this value would be 10%. So in terms of income, the global top 10% captures about half of the total, whereas the global bottom 50% captures a little less than 10% of the total. So when we compare this to wealth, and that's the first time we're able to produce these results that we feel confident with at the global level, thanks to new work done in terms of publishing aggregate wealth series for all world countries and producing estimates of the distribution of this wealth within countries. Well, we find, it's not surprising, these larger levels of wealth inequality, but the levels are striking nonetheless. 3/4 of global wealth captured by the top 10% and close to 0% for the global bottom 50%, just 2% of the total for the bottom half, the poorest half of the world population. Now, I'll come back to wealth in a minute, but what I'd like to stress here is really the diversity of income inequality regimes across the world, which is what you can see on this slide here, where you have the same three metrics: share of income accruing to the bottom 50%, middle 40%, and top 10%. And we observe, very unequal regimes in sub-Saharan Africa, in the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, with a bottom 50% share lower than 10%, a top 10% share close to 55 or 60%. And this is to be contrasted to more equal inequality regimes, so to say, where the top 10% is closer to 35% in a country, in countries of the European Union, for instance. Now, a novelty from this report is post-tax versus pre-tax distribution. And bottom line is inequality differences after taxes are mainly due, when we compare levels across the globe, we observe that differences across countries and inequality after taxes are mainly due to inequality gaps before taxes. And what you see on this graph, so that's another indicator of inequality. We just divide the average income of the top 10% by the average income of the bottom 50%. We do this before taxes on the x-axis, and we also do this after taxes on the y-axis. And what we observe here is what I was suggesting, is that most of the gap, most of the differences that we observe after taxes already exist before taxes. So this highlights, this points to the importance of pre-distribution mechanisms. And I'll say a few more words on that later on, but what we try to discuss at length in the report is, in fact, the importance of thinking about pre-distribution and redistribution really as two halves of the same walnut, because indeed, pre-distribution might include mechanisms like investments in equalitarian access to education or to health, and these public investments must be funded, must be budgeted. And how to do that without further enhancing inequality, well, that's the role of taxes, and progressive taxes in particular. And I'll say a few more words on these links later on. Now let me turn to wealth inequality and to how regions are different or not when it comes to looking at their wealth inequality levels. And here the bottom line is that, you know, when we look at income, there are some regions that are relatively equal. Take the example of the European countries, for instance, and a few other countries in the world. When it comes to wealth, well, we don't see any region in the world where the bottom 50% owns more than 5% of the total. So bottom line, you know, looking at wealth inequality, there are extreme levels of inequalities everywhere, and even in countries which more or less manage to keep income inequality in check so far. The richest 10% own around 60 to 80% of the total wherever you are in the world, and the bottom 50% systematically owns less than 5%. In just a few countries, the bottom 50% is actually a little over 5%, perhaps 6 or 7%. Now, let's look at the evolution of these, at the dynamics of both income and wealth inequality over the past decades, and then I also look at the more long run picture. The novelty of this report is that we're now able to have a much better picture of the dynamics of global wealth. In the previous edition, we were limited to a couple of large regions, and now we have this finer, more granular picture. So what we observe is this this graph, which I guess many are familiar with, the so-called global elephant graphs of inequality, with the x-axis plotting each income, but in this case it's wealth owner from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right, and on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, what we plot here is the per adult real wealth growth rate over the years, and this is a per adult annual growth rate. And so what we observe is that there is around 3 to 4% annual wealth growth rate for the bottom 50% of the population. This rises to 4.5% for the middle, the percentile 60 to 70 of the global distribution. This drops below 3% for the top 10% minus the top 1%, where these annual growth rates are very high and reach up to 9%, which is what you also observe when you look at the Forbes rich list, for instance. About 7 to 9% annual wealth growth rate, which is indeed extremely high growth rates when you have societies where income is going to grow at 1.5% per year and wealth is going to grow perhaps at 2.5 or 2.8% per year. Here, what is also very striking is indeed the share of income captured by the very, very top of the distribution. Indeed, one may, say, looking at such a graph, that what is happening at the top is not much of a problem because, the top is growing fast and that's very good for them. But here, what we reveal is, in fact, that the top is growing very fast and, in fact, sizing a substantial amount of total wealth growth over the years. The top 1% captured 38% of the total, whereas the poorest half of the world population captured, just 2% of the total. So they start with close to nothing. Rates of growth are not ridiculous, 3.5% per year, but the overall value that they capture is still very, very small. In fact, close to insignificant, just 2% of the total. Indeed, what characterizes the past 30 years or so is the rise of multimillionaires and the rise of global billionaires, which is what you observe on this graph here, with the top 0.01% at the global level, capturing 7% of total household wealth in 1995, and now close to 11 or more than 11% today, with a non-negligible part of this rise also happening in 2021 during the COVID crisis. Now, this rise in wealth inequality between households should also be understood in the context of this continued this continued gap and growing gap between the wealth of the private sector versus the wealth of the government sector. And here we're also updating data from earlier work. And what you observe on this graph is the evolution of private wealth, which here is measured as a percentage of national income. Why we're doing that? Because we just want to measure the total size of private wealth relative to the size of the economy. And this is why we are here using national income as a denominator. And what we observe is this very strong, continued, persistent increase in private wealth. So private wealth is the total value of wealth owned by private actors in the economy, net of their debts. So that can be financial wealth, like equity shares. This can be non-financial wealth, like owning housing, for instance. This value, so what's owned by the private sector, net of its debt, has increased from about 300% of national income in the 1970s to about 600% today. Whereas the value of public wealth, so whatever in the economy belongs to the governments, to the public sector, again, net of government debt, dropped from about 80% or 100% of national income in 1970 to close to 0% and sometimes even below 0% today. And this has been reinforced during the COVID crisis. So what does it mean when the government owns just 0% of total wealth? Well, this means that if the government of the UK, for instance, or of the US wanted to sell all its assets, all the infrastructures it owns, all the hospitals or the school it owns to the private sector to repay its debt, it would just be able to repay its debt. And then it would not own anything anymore, and citizens would have to pay a fee for the use of any infrastructure or any asset in a country. This is what zero net public wealth actually means today. And this is a very important dimension of wealth inequality, which we should factor in more in public policy discussions, because arguably governments and societies where government wealth is so low are face more challenges when it comes to facing issues like climate change, for instance, or how to invest in education or health to limit, to reduce potentially a further rise in inequality. It's more difficult to do these investments when your wealth position is close to zero. I'm not here plotting countries like China, for instance, or other emerging countries, but it is interesting to see that current China, in terms of the breakdown between what belongs to the government versus what belongs to the private sector. So what in China, the value would be about 30% of total wealth belongs to the government, 70% to the private sector, is more or less the kinds of levels, the kind of breakdown that you observed in rich countries in 1970. Whereas today, when we look at the breakdown between net wealth owned by government and the private sector in rich countries, well, close to 100% is owned by the private sector in rich countries. This is not the case in some countries in the world. And within the rich world, we also discuss some particularities in some countries like Norway, for instance, diverge from this general trend that we observe. We can discuss perhaps more afterwards of such cases. Now let me move to the long run picture, and here we're building up on the new set of data produced on the World Inequality Database. So we're mobilizing these long-run tax data series for many countries, emerging countries like India, like South Africa, rich countries in Europe or in the US. And we're trying to combine these series as best as we can in order to provide these long-run perspectives. And we're also building up on the framework developed by Bourguignon and Morisson in their paper in the early 2000s on the long-run global income inequality. Here, the difference really is the use of tax data and the fact that we peg everything to national accounts and trying to distribute again the totality of national income. And this is what we find. This is what we observe. So on this graph, we have inequality from 1820 to 2020. The indicator we use, I've used it once before in this presentation. So that's the ratio of the average income of the top 10% to the average income of the poorest half of the population. What we observe on this graph is that, well, there is a please beware that the y-axis is in log scale. And what we observe here is indeed an important increase. So our ratio is multiplied by 2 between 1820 and 1920 during the rise of Western imperialism and the expansion of the political, economic, and military order ruled by Western countries in the 19th century. And in fact, if we compare today's levels of inequalities at the global level, so our ratio, the indicator, which I was just referring to, is about 40 times. Top 10% earn about 38 times more than the bottom 50% today in 2020. And this value is a little lower than what we observed in 1980 at the very peak. For this indicator, at the very peak over the entire period, we observe a slight decrease, and this slight decrease, we've discussed it over the and academic debates, policy debates have taken quite some time to discuss this decrease in global inequality, largely due to the rise of emerging countries since the mid-2000s. But if we replace this in a broader perspective, global income inequality remains about as high today as at the peak of Western imperialism in the early 20th century. So now, indeed, political structures, the way the world is organized from a military point of view is extremely different. But in terms of how incomes are distributed around the world, we are at levels that are comparable today as 100 years back. Now, let's look a little more into what happened over this period of time when we look at this important distinction, when we think of global inequality, this important distinction of what is actually driving this global inequality. Is it essentially differences between countries, so differences in average incomes, or is it differences within countries? So that's differences in incomes between groups of people within a nation, within a country. And well, there's no surprise here for the starting point. In 1820, most of global inequality is actually due to inequalities within countries. There are relatively little differences, little gaps in average incomes between world regions. This is going to change significantly between 1820 and 1950 with the rise of the West, the economic and the political rise of the West, and in many cases to the detriment of developing countries. And so the relative importance of within, the within component is going to decrease. And this is going to happen until the 1980s, even after the independence movement in developing and former colonial societies. What is striking now is that since 1980, we observe this return of the within component to the extent that we're back to a situation where global inequality is mostly explained by within inequalities. And when I say that, I am not underestimating the amount, the level of between country inequalities. What I'm saying here is that on top of large inequalities between countries, we even have larger, relatively speaking, larger inequalities within countries. And this is what you observe on this tile decomposition below. In terms of income shares, and perhaps to further discuss and illustrate what I was just saying, let's just look at the shares of income captured by the poorest half of the global population, the middle 40% and the top 10%. This is what you see on this graph. In fact, today, despite growth in the emerging world since for the past 20 years, the global bottom 50% still captures less than 7.5% of the total, or 8% of the total. And this is significantly lower than what we observed in 1820, 1840, 1860. The top 10% captures over 50% of the total today. So yes, inequalities, global inequalities have reduced over the past 30 years, but from a historical perspective, this should be relativized. Now, let me move to other dimensions of the work, and which you'll find in the report if you're interested in further reading what's in this report. I focus on 2 points here: gender and carbon inequalities. So first, looking at gender inequalities, I don't want to bore you with the methodological details here, and we can discuss this should we have the time in the discussion. But what we try to do in this chapter is to provide a relatively original way to look at gender inequalities. And here we mobilize a lot of data that is already out there to produce an indicator which we think is at the same time simple and powerful. And the indicator which we're going to look at is really how total labor earnings are split between men and women. And so to produce this indicator, we need 2 basically bits of information: the earnings gap for a given activity level and the employment ratio between men and women. And we're combining data on employment and data on earnings gap. And we feel that it's important to combine these two indicators to have a systemic perspective on gender inequalities. Because if we just look at the gender gap within a sector of the economy, for instance, within or for a given occupation, we are sometimes, missing the fact that there might be important inequalities in terms of occupation or important inequalities in terms of which jobs are occupied by men and women, or actually who just gets on the labor market. And so this, for different regions of the world, is the split. So what you see in green here is going to be your earnings ratio between 1990 and 2020. And in blue, it's going to be the employment ratio. So in a fully equal world between, or region between men and women, all these regions would be at 100% here, if earnings and if employment ratio were the same. So what we observe here is, a variety of pathways since 1990 when we look at regions, some improvement, some regions where it's just the earnings ratio that is increasing. Look at Middle East, North Africa, for instance. Employment ratio is not moving. Regions where, in fact, both indicators are slightly increasing. Look at North America, for instance, slight increase in the earnings ratio, slight increase in the employment ratio. Regions where you have actually a decline in both indicators. And this is China, for instance, where you have a decline in the earnings ratio, decline in the employment ratio. This is also something that has been discussed in parts of the literature on this issue. What we try to produce here, so it's when we combine these two dimensions, this is what we observe. Our overall labor gender inequality indicator. What we see is the gap towards gender parity, and in all regions we observe that women gender shares is still pretty far from parity, with women capturing between 15% and 40% of total labor earnings across regions in the world today. At the global level, how does this play out? Well, if we pull all countries together, and here we're going to weigh countries according to their economic weight. So this is weighting, we're weighting countries according to their population weight. What we observe here is a slight increase towards global gender parity since 1990, but today we still live in a world where women capture just a third, 34.7% of total gender earnings. At current rates, we would need about 100 years to reach 50%. So women own half the sky, but just 30% of all labor earnings today. Okay, so that's in a nutshell, and I'll try to come back on what this means from a policy perspective if I have time before the end of this intervention. So I'll say a few words and I'll conclude on carbon inequality. I'll skip the method part just to focus on the big broad results here. So in a nutshell, what we do is we combine our wealth and income inequality data with data on emissions, on emissions that take into account not only emissions from the fuel that you put in your car and the energy that you need to heat your home, but also the energy that's embedded in the goods and in the services that sustain your own lifestyle as an individual. So we really try to look at the full carbon footprints of individuals. And what we find is this strong concentration of the climate problem in a relatively small segment of the population. So close to half of all emissions are actually released by the top 10% of the population, and about 17% of the population are released by the top 1% of the population. This global inequality is not just a rich versus poor country issue. What we show here is that there are high emitters in poor countries and low emitters in rich countries. In Europe, the poorest half of the population emits just 5 tons of carbon per person per year, and the richest 10% of the population, about 30 tons of carbon per person per year. In the US, multiply these values for each of these groups by 2 on average. So why is this so important? Well, because, for instance, when we look at the US, and this general message is going to be very similar if I was looking at the UK, at France, or at Germany. So here's what we get. Full population in the US, on average, 21 tons of carbon per person per year. In European societies, again, divide by 2. It's not going to be 21, it's going to be around 10 tons on average. In the US, the bottom 10% is 2 times below the average, around 10 tons. The top 10, around 75 tons. If we look at, and this is what you observe on this graph, if you look at the objectives set by the US government for itself to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, there's a trajectory. This trajectory has a midpoint, 2030. And in 2030, according to US objective, everybody should be at 11 tons of carbon per person per year. What this graph shows is that, in fact, half of the population is already at the target, whereas the top half of the population isn't, and is actually pretty far from it. And so the point here is that when we develop climate policies between now and 2030, that in many cases are going to ask significant efforts from the poorest half of the population, from the bottom 50%, I'm talking, for instance, of policies like carbon taxes, do we really have in mind the fact that, in fact, this group of the population has, so to say, already done a big part of the job of reducing emissions, not always voluntarily indeed, but at least today it is already at the target. And this is going to be the same, again, in a country like the UK, like France, or like Germany, if we're looking at the targets set by these countries. So where do we go from there? I'll finish on the need for carbon and integrated carbon and social policies, but before, I'd like to say a little general wrap up on what we've on the picture which I've tried to sketch here since the beginning of this presentation, and I'll conclude then on carbon and social policies. So in general, what do we get? How do we get to a more equal world? What do we learn from this World Inequality Report? Some, fairly basic yet important messages. Economic development is good, but not good enough. Increasing economic growth is really not a sufficient condition for increasing development, in particular in situation of highly unequal growth, as we've been observing in many emerging countries. Second point, post-tax redistribution is good, but not enough. And this is where pre-distribution really appears as key here. And neoclassical economics are, indeed often a narrow frame to understand how to perform this pre-distribution. Indeed, here I was mentioning earlier this need for a more integrated approach of post-tax and pre-tax. Why I was saying that? Because indeed, investments in access to basic goods, in egalitarian access to basic goods, need to be financed. How do we finance these in a highly unequal society where income and wealth is highly concentrated? Well, progressive taxation is an important tool from a basic effectiveness and efficiency point of view, but also from if we factor in political economy constraints that might be applied to raising more money in countries where wealth is highly concentrated. There's another important part here of the discussion, which I didn't really get into, but it's the role of taxes in equalizing pre-tax inequality in the years to come. Because indeed, high or highly progressive income and wealth taxes today are going to limit the possibility for capital accumulation and capital incomes tomorrow. So might also contribute to limiting pre-tax inequality in the future. This is really where we need to have this more integrated approach to these two dimensions. Finally, we've seen that there are large wealth inequalities, which also translate into pollution inequalities. And for that, again, we think that investments are key, public investments are key. And it's important today, while a lot of actors are thinking about what are going to be the energy systems, the transportation systems, the production systems of tomorrow, that we factor two things. One is this long-run decline in public wealth. How do we ensure that the energy transition is not going to further increase this decline and might actually contribute to re-equilibrating this balance of power between public ownership of capital and private ownership of capital? And second, how do we ensure that the investments made from a social perspective, investments in health and education, are also good from a climate point of view? Here, the potentially good news is that more investment in things that are good for pre-distribution, health, education, have a relatively small carbon impact as compared to many other ways to spend money to invest in the economy. And I will actually stop here for the sake of the discussion, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Lucas. That was incredibly broad and insightful sort of panorama. Reminds me of the big reports that we used to do at the World Bank. It's very, very useful to have all of that information put together, reflecting lots and lots of work from lots of people, as you said. So let's have time for questions. We have one from Partho. Before I hand over to him, if anybody else would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. There's some people sending stuff in the chat. It would be great if you just raise your hand and then I'll ask you to speak. So, and maybe we'll group 2 or 3. So Partho, you first, please.
Well, mine is basically a clarificatory question. Does the diagram showing the income share of women versus men and the inequality thereof, does that diagram use only those who are in organized work, that is earning market wages, or do the numbers include all females and males in the working age group, say 15 to 50 or 15 to 60, etc.? So depending on what it is, the results, of course, would vary. That's my question.
Okay, thanks, Partho. Now, Rahul Singh had a question. He says, Lucas, he says, what's your thought on the role of socioeconomic networks in the rise of inequality? So the role of socioeconomic networks in the rise in inequality. Maybe you want to take those two?
Thanks, Chico and Pardo, for the question. So, for the gender series, the income flows that are there are whatever we observe in household surveys, and so whatever shows up in household surveys is going to be present. And so, in certain cases, surveys here, are not presenting a full representation of the picture. So probably we're in fact basically underestimating the level of gender inequality in some economies, in the sense that in many cases where there are agricultural incomes, these are split between men and women of the household. And, we might think of, of course, different ways that this is actually being split within these households. But again, this is what comes out of the survey. Here, the work and this very important development of the World Inequality Database is done by Theresa Neef and Anne-Sophie Robillard. And the paper is entitled Half the Sky. I was referring to that, Women's Share in a Global Perspective. It's also available so in the report and also as a separate paper on the World Inequality website. Now, on networks, what's the role of social and socioeconomic networks? Well, I think, our basic view here is that in order to access these socioeconomic networks and to make the most of it, individuals need to have access to basic goods, basic training, basic health, and that, public policy is indeed key in order to ensure equal access to these networks. And one of them is indeed education. But again, education has a price, and this arises the question of how we are financing it.
Great. Thanks, Lucas. I see some other questions in the chat. So Luna Glucksberg, III research fellow, asks, would it be possible to show or estimate carbon, not just from personal carbon footprint, but from the businesses these individuals control or own? This would be relevant for the top 1% or 10%, I suspect.
Okay, so quickly, the estimates here provide a first attempt to do so. So when we look at the individual footprints of people here, a part of this footprints is associated actually to the savings / the investments made by people. And so, in fact, these emissions from businesses, a part of the emissions are going to be in fact, serving the end users of the products consumed. But a part of these emissions, and the way we conceptualize this in the framework, is all emissions that firms do that are associated to their own investments. So building new factories, investing in new machines, these are directly associated to the decision makers of these firms, to those who own the businesses. And these are ultimately repatriated, attributed to the owners of firms, and this is what is done in this in these numbers. So you have both. You have emissions associated to your consumption, but also when you own, parts of the productive apparatus, well, to the emissions of this productive apparatus. Yeah.
So obviously the key thing there is to, as you explained, to avoid the double counting, right?
And the input-output framework is a great framework to basically avoid this double counting. And so everything here is pegged into national account and input-outputs, where in national accounts you can easily, relatively speaking, but at least you have a conceptual framework where you are going to be able to distinguish emissions from consumption, private consumption, emission from government, emissions from private investments, and in a fully consistent way. That is, you're not counting one emission twice, or not one flow of a euro, of pound twice.
Yeah. I mean, I would have lots of clarification questions about the attribution then of what goes into investment to specific shareholders and so on would require an enormous amount of data and information on the structure of ownership and so on.
But perhaps you're absolutely right, Chico. At the same time, as compared to what we were showing before, when you have half of the population that just doesn't own financial asset at all, and the top 10% that owns perhaps 70%, sometimes 80% of all financial assets, you have a very good first order, approximation of the problem on how to reallocate these emissions associated to business investments. And so we basically use this general conceptual, representation of the problem to attribute these emissions.
Yeah, no, that's great. You and I could talk at length about the details, but I want to get in the last question here from Ellen Emke from the Robert Bosch Stiftung, who apparently tried to raise her hand, but it didn't work on the computer. So she says, thank you very much for the great work to you and the entire WIL crowd. WID does not only provide novel and high quality data on inequality, but when reading the report, you also clearly make the political case for reducing inequalities. When you published the report, on what did you get more reaction? The data or the policy suggestions? If policies, which suggestions were rather picked up? And linked to that, if we want to bring down inequalities, what role do you see for better data and maybe its dissemination to convince policymakers and a wider audience? And what else is needed? Wow, for that one, you have 1 minute, Lucas.
Yeah, well, perhaps just 2 points. First, we need to continue to push governments to basically do these publications by themselves. And I think there is there's a heuristic dimension here, also learning by doing. My colleagues, Emmanuel says, Gabriel Zuckman have just published real-time distributional national accounts for the US, mobilizing quarterly data, so to be able to really track month after month or quarter after quarter the evolution of inequality. I think really this is a first basic step that all governments should do, at least in rich countries where there is fiscal or where there's budget capacity to do so. We're trying to work with developments in developing or emerging countries to help them, to assist them doing so. So the first thing, transparency and timely information on the distribution of income and wealth. And the second point, I think it's really, the time is getting right for a renewal of the tax system, and you see this in many policy debates, and I think it's been growing over the past years, the modernization of tax progressivity. So that might still take quite some time, and we see, for instance, in the US that there are political constraints and deadlocks, but I think the momentum is getting right, and we've seen in Argentina, for instance, introduction of the wealth tax. We've seen the importance of this debate during the German elections. And so this is, I think, still growing, and momentum is coming here.
Thank you, Lucas. Actually, let me end on that note by saying that I think the work that the World Inequality Lab has been doing over the last number of years has huge impact on the policy discussions worldwide. So thank you for that, and thank you for taking the time today to speak to us.
Thank you so much.
Here. And for everyone else, thanks for attending, and I hope to see you next week at our next seminar. So thanks again to Lucas, very nice presentation. And
bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.